A third strike on Pearl Harbor. This is in a lot of ways a fairly popular thing in alternate history circles, alongside its even less likely counterparts of a successful invasion of Hawaii. This does include published works by famous authors. While I have thoughts on that topic, this video is not going to be the place for it. This one will focus on the facts as to why the Japanese did not do a third wave, and at a later date, I can maybe do an alternate history scenario on what would happen if they had. There's a reason this is a history short story video and not an alternate history video. So, let's cover what a third wave would likely have looked like to begin with. For this, you need to look at what the Japanese actually had available to send. It doesn't matter what you want them to do, you have to look at what they actually can do. As is fairly well known, even outside historical circles, Japan had 6 aircraft carriers available. Between them, these 6 carriers would have held about 400 combat-capable aircraft. This number can be lowered a bit in regards to effective strike aircraft, though, as a good chunk would have been Zeros for escort duty. Certainly a problem for planes on the ground and in the air, for men running around and out of cover, for strafing up things, but not going to do much to the ships in the harbor, and certainly not to the ground facilities. So a good estimate would have about 280, 300 planes, plus or minus a bit, for proper striking operations, actually sinking ships and damaging ground facilities. That, of course, is at the start of the attack. It is also counting spares that would need to be assembled and may or may not have had actual pilots by the time you break them out. Because, over the course of the first 2 waves, the Japanese lost 29 planes. Now, let's just round it up. 30 planes doesn't sound like very much. It isn't very much when you have 400 planes to throw at the problem. The problem comes in the fact that they had another 70 or so damaged to varying degrees. These planes may or may not be possible to repair by the time a hypothetical third wave, or third strike, I'll probably alternate between those two, is launched. One can assume some of these planes could be repaired or replaced by spares, but some of them are not going to be able to be replaced or repaired, and some of the ones that can be have their pilots wounded or otherwise unable to continue. This is going to be where we would get somewhat into speculation territory, though less about alternate history and more make an educated guess as to what they had left. So, the first wave was 183 planes. This was made up of 89 B-5N bombers, half with bombs, half with torpedoes. Those were directed at the capital ships. A further 51 D-3A dive bombers targeted the airfield, while 43 Zeros were sent against aircraft on the ground. This is not counting a handful of planes that, for whatever reason, failed to launch. Keep that in mind. The second wave, for its part, was 54 B-5Ns, this time directed at hangars and aircraft. 78 D-3As were directed at the absent aircraft carriers, alongside smaller ships like cruisers. There were only 35 Zeros this time, for strafing and escort. 167 aircraft, because again, a few planes failed to launch. For those keeping track, the Japanese had 350 planes in these 2 waves, counting the Zeros. Previously mentioned, they lost 29 planes, with a further 70 or so damaged to some extent or another. To try and keep speculation to a minimum, let's just cross out all of those planes, since you have to speculate a lot on how many the Japanese could repair or replace. That makes 99 planes, potentially, unable to participate in any third wave. That leaves, in theory, about 250 or so left. A third strike would, in this regard, probably resemble the other 2 in general form, though the details are getting a tad bit too deep into alternate history for this video. This is where we leave speculation and come into facts again. It takes time to prepare an attack. This is a large part of the reason why the Japanese were caught the way they were at Midway. Repairing planes, breaking out spares, refueling and rearming intact planes while letting the pilots rest. All of that takes time. This is also ignoring that both the first and second wave would have to be landed before a third wave could be launched. Not least because there weren't enough spare planes to send a proper third strike out without pulling planes returned from the other two. A third wave would come much later than the first two had, and it's entirely possible that because of that, the planes would have to return and land at night. This was not something the Japanese were trained for, surprisingly enough. Because I know it's a bit of a meme in the historical community, how much the Japanese love their night battles. But they weren't really training their pilots to land at night. To be fair, almost no one was doing that except for possibly the British. One can argue they would probably lose quite a few planes and pilots just trying to land, and that's ignoring any American defensive fire. Imagine trying to land a plane at night on a ship rolling in the waves when you aren't trained for it and may or may not be damaged, low on fuel, or wounded. Furthermore, Nagumo had no idea where the American carriers were, or if there were land-based bombers that could strike his fleet. As it turns out, Enterprise was racing towards the harbor and would arrive the next day. Lexington wasn't close enough to directly support, but could have been there relatively soon. Past this, you also have to look at the fuel situation of the Japanese fleet. The thing of it is, Pearl Harbor, the strike on it, was really pushing Japanese fuel logistics to its breaking point. They were splitting their oilers quite heavily here to support attacking in basically three directions. Towards the Central Pacific Islands, towards Pearl Harbor, towards the South Pacific. And Japan just did not have enough oilers. As such, it's generally estimated that if the Japanese had stayed any longer than they already had around Hawaii, they would have risked having to leave destroyers behind, probably scuttling them to prevent capture, because they were that low on fuel. Sticking around through the day of December 7th and into the night for a third strike? Well, one can question if it's worth it to lose destroyers to plain lack of fuel, when Japan already struggled to build a bare handful of new ones in the course of the historical Pacific War. That thought was almost certainly running through Nagumo's head, alongside the previously mentioned concerns about the carriers and American strike aircraft. This is, most likely, why a third strike never happened historically. The Japanese had lost, or seen damaged, nearly a third of their strike force in the historical attack. They would have had to land and refuel planes just to expect most of them to return for a dangerous night landing, on top of not knowing where the American carriers are and running a real risk of losing some of their own ships to simple lack of fuel to make the return trip. To the Japanese perspective, in that moment, they saw the American fleet crippled and their own risking itself every moment it remained near Hawaii. Why would they have wanted to do a third wave? Aggressive commanders may or may not have wanted to. This is where things get somewhat murky and contradictory in the face of lacking records and dead officers. But it must have seemed as if the attack was a great success, as it was, and sticking around was risking turning a stunning victory, or what probably seemed like one, into something rather less successful. In this regard, it is easy to see why there is little firm evidence of the men on the spot pushing for such an attack. They would have sacrificed who knows how many planes, pilots, and even ships to batter an already crippled fleet further. As for the oil tanks and dock facilities, well, that's getting into speculation again for reasons I'm about to get into. The best source for such an idea, and for a third wave in general, comes from Mitsuo Fuchida. The thing of it is, though, Fuchida gave these interviews post-war, so with the benefit of hindsight, and was contradicting himself left, right, and center. Sometimes he'd say it was a real option. Sometimes he'd say it wasn't. Sometimes he'd say it would target the oil farms. Sometimes he'd say it would target the remaining ships. It's very hard to judge what the target of a hypothetical third strike would have been. The main source couldn't even make up his own mind on what it would have been. This is like that M1 video I did. Even if it's a source who was on the ground at the time, you need to be skeptical when they start getting contradictory with themselves like this. I'm not going to knock on Fuchida here. Americans would do this, British would do this, Germans would do this. It's just a thing that with the benefit of hindsight, you're going to say, I totally would have done this thing. In Fuchida's case, though, it doesn't help that he contradicted himself just as much in other interviews and books on other topics. So generally speaking, most historians today don't see him as a really reliable source. A source to look at, but one to look at skeptically. As such, and on the spot in 1941, most evidence points to any third wave being something not seriously considered. Even Admiral Yamamoto would congratulate Nagumo on his success without criticizing him for not launching a third strike. There's some evidence Yamamoto would later regret not doing so, but again, hindsight is 20/20. It is hard to believe anyone felt regret on the Japanese side for what seemed a success beyond their wildest hope other than the lack of hitting carriers. Which comes back to the ultimate purpose of this video, to look at what the Japanese had available for a third wave and why they made the choice not to. They might have been able to scrape together a strike equivalent to the first two, but at the potential cost of even more planes and pilots, possibly even ships. It is easy to see why they chose not to, even with the value of hindsight in the modern day.